Hello, and welcome to Charisms for Catholics. My name is Jill Simons, and I'm the executive director at Many Parts Ministries, where we equip the body of Christ by helping people learn about and discern their charisms, which is really another word for spiritual gifts. When you discern your charisms, you're able to see how the Holy Spirit is already active in your life and where He is inviting you.
Hello, and welcome to today's
further
episode
build
of
the
Charisms
church.
for Catholics.
Let's
We
dive
are
in.
continuing our series going through saints for the different individual charisms. And this is really to give you inspiration and an idea of what it looks like to live these charisms with heroic virtue to the extent where you're being recognized by the church. And this is something that is such a beautiful really measuring stick to include in your personal reflection on your use of your charisms. And ultimately, the fullness of every single charism is lived in the life of Christ. And He is ultimately the measuring stick that we always want to be looking towards. And we want to be growing more in conformity to Christ every day. But all of the saints show us the many diverse ways that there are to do that. And so today we're going to be talking about saints for the charism of evangelism, which is a charism that terrifies so many people. This is the number one, I think, evangelism and voluntary poverty are the two charisms that people come up to me and are like, I'm scared to take the test because I don't want to have one of these two charisms. So I will say now what I always say to them, which is if something sounds like not what you don't want, essentially, then it's not what you have. The charisms are never given as punishments. Evangelism as a charism is a sincere desire to share the faith with people through your testimony, through the example of what it is that God has done for you personally, and then inviting other people into that. Not every single person is called to widely give their testimony. It's a great thing. St. Peter says, or St. Paul says, I should say, be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within you. It's good to be able to briefly articulate why you are Catholic and what it is that God has done for you. But many people are not called to do that on a wide scale. But people with an evangelism charism are. This is something that one of their responsibilities within the church is to share their testimony. It is to share what it is that God has done for them. And by doing so, to bring about conversion in people. So today we're going to be hearing about several different saints who did just that, who shared their testimony really openly, really bravely, and experienced mass amounts of conversion in response to that. So to share with us about that, today we have Teresa Zoe Williams, one of our staff writers with us. She's going to be talking with us about several different saints for the charism of evangelization, or I should say evangelism. I am so thankful for you for being
so
here
much,
with me,
Jill.
Teresa.
I love doing this project. It's just a joy in my life.
So who is our
first one
saint
is
for
one
evangelism?
of my absolute favorite saints and someone we've talked about before for missionary, but Saint Francis Xavier. So along with his missionary charism, he was given the charism of evangelism to spread the good news, to spread the gospel. That's really what he wanted to do. So when he thought he wasn't going to go to the missions, he was devising other ways that he could evangelize in the culture and where he was. But when he was finally sent to the missions, something that I thought was very profound that he did was he would translate all the prayers, like the Our Father and the Hail Mary and the Creed and things like that. He'd translate this into local languages, which are dialectal and not like it would be the difference between translating something into American English or British English. We use different terms for different things, and
Right.
even though it's all the same language. But so he'd translate into the actual dialects of where he was, not just the overall official language. And he did that so everyone could understand what he's saying and understand on a personal level. And because there's something so personal about being spoken to you in your own language. There's the language that you think in, and maybe you're blessed to think in more than one language. I am not. But whatever language that is the language that you've grown up with and is really your identity in a lot of ways is really tied to language, because it's how we communicate with each other and with ourselves. So there's something really personal about translating prayers into a dialect, that like that.
Yeah.
Um, and he'd also look at the local customs and draw similarities between them and Catholicism, and just show them how Christ was already working in their lives without them knowing it, and then bringing them to a fuller understanding of Christ and his good works.
And that's such a common marriage of charisms that we see is missionary with evangelism, where there is so much feedback that happens between the two of those. And this brings up a great point that a lot of times there's clearly both acting, as in with Saint Francis Xavier. And people are like, is it this charism or that charism that they're using? Well, you're one person,
Right.
so it's all in the pot. Like it's all mixed in there together. And we don't have to have a one-to-one ascription of, oh, this was this charism and this was that charism and stuff. And so those examples that you're giving are a great example of that fusion where there's that cultural aspect of missionary that's present there, but then there's also that testimony aspect of evangelism that are working together to be exactly what
Right.
that
And
situation
Francis
needs in a
Xavier is
person.
so great, obviously, but he's so great for this because he shared his own story when he would go along too, and how he used to be caught up in worldly things and liked the faith, but didn't put much stock in it, didn't put his eggs in a basket, if you will. That was not his basket. The church was
Yeah.
not his basket. And how he came through that through the help of his friend Ignatius, and how that changed the entire course of his life,
Mhm.
this real meeting with the person of Jesus Christ. And so that's what he brought to others as well. And that's
Mhm.
really where I see the evangelism coming out as separated, if we have to separate them out a little bit, as separated from the missionary, where he was sharing his story of faith and of the good news of the Lord in his life, along with going into these culturally diverse places and making the faith what it is, which is culturally diverse.
Yeah, absolutely. I know everyone is
Yeah,
familiar with
you
our
should
next
be anyway.
saint who has
The
yes,
next one is
hopefully.
Saint Luke, and he's actually called Saint Luke the Evangelist because he wrote one of the four Gospels. And gospel literally means the good news. So he's literally spreading the good news, which is part of what evangelism is. And we also get more on the life of Mary from him than from any other gospel writer. It's possible that she lived with him for a time, or that he knew John very well when Mary lived with him. But the way that he infused his own understanding of the world and his own experiences through his gospel retelling is really, he's still one of the synoptic gospels, but it still has a very different tone and flavor than Matthew and Mark, who are just like the long version of,
Yeah.
or the short version of each other. um, Luke's has a completely different feel to
Mhm.
it than those. um, and I love that because that really shows like his personality and his personhood in the writing of this. He wasn't just some tool to be used and discarded. He really was an intimate part of this.
Yep, absolutely. And then we come to other New Testament saints as well who really lived this out in kind of an unprecedented way,
Yes. And I
even
group them
since.
together because they lived it out very similarly, and they're contemporaries. So Saints
Mhm.
Peter and Paul, gosh, they just went far and wide and spread the news. So they probably, we've talked about it, they probably had the missionary charism as well. How many of Paul's letters are like, I did this and now I'm this way, so you should do this because that's how you're going to get this way and come to Christ. Yeah, and St. Peter's are the same way, very
Yes.
intimate, very personal, very calling on his own experiences with Christ, his personal encounters with Christ, to call us into greater relationship with God. I have this note I wrote makes me laugh. He, both of them, they couldn't shut up once the power of Jesus manifested in their lives. Like, they just couldn't keep it to themselves. They had to
Yeah.
get it out and they had to spread the word.
Yeah.
And we talk about in the papacy, the Petrine and the Pauline aspects, and that just shows you wouldn't have had St. Peter without St. Paul, or St. Paul without St. Peter. They really couldn't have done what they did for the church, for Christ, for the world, had they not both been there and iron sharpening iron, because they didn't always get along, and they often were calling each other out. We have evidence of that in the letters, but they loved each other very dearly and deeply, and just that iron sharpening iron, really, to make it into this big
Yeah.
thing that it became.
And they were
Oh
iron
yeah.
and flint to a certain extent, because there was definitely a huge
Yeah.
inflaming of faith that came about from their relationship and from their works. As we're talking about these, this is giving me an idea for kind of future episodes, future recordings on like
Mm,
common pairings, like charisms that and a lot, and kind of what you expect to see in those things, because they have that kind of trifecta of probably, especially as martyrs, being people that receive a lot more of the charisms, like we talk
mhm,
about in that third stage of identity,
mhm.
where there is like a really high level of given gifts. But that said, even when people reach a point of really strong conformity of Christ, there is almost always still a very distinct marking of specific charisms in the
Yeah.
flavor of sainthood that they live. And so you have people like St. Peter and St. Paul, who likely had received very many, if not all, of the charisms in their growth in conformity to Christ, but being really marked by this trifecta of
Yes.
missionary, and that being something that really allows us to continue to encounter them in a very specific way and their story. And I think about others that we've talked about, very holy saints. John Paul II comes to mind, and other people where clearly there was probably at the end stages of their life, all of them operating in some level, but there's still a very specific like foundation. Like John Paul II is like that leadership, hospitality, and I would have there's probably a lot of arguments about what we'd say is the third one for him, but this
Yeah.
very clear flavor in their sainthood. And I think that is something
Yes,
that's
I
so clear
agree
in
with
these
you
specifically.
wholeheartedly. Um,
And then I'm such a fan of our last saint for, evangelism here. He's
oh,
kind of one of my personal patrons that chose me,
St.
and so I'm
Patrick.
excited to talk about him.
Gosh, I'm part Irish, so he's always played a huge part in my life, and not just on St. Patrick's Day, but really, my family has always been Catholic for as far back as we can trace it, and that's probably in great part. I bet if we had enough records, we could trace back to someone who knew Patrick, because he was so instrumental in the
Mhm.
conversion of Ireland, that it was just so widespread. But his story is really neat. He wasn't Irish at all. He was English, and he was sold as a slave when he was a young person and sent to Ireland to work. And eventually he escaped and went back to England and became a priest, and was had this what am I supposed to do with my life kind of crisis going on. And he kept getting
Mhm.
a sense that he should return to Ireland, and he was a little wary of that because he was a slave there. What are they going to do to him if he returns? And the people around him were a little wary of it for the same reasons. And he was finally just like, this is obviously what I'm being called to. I need to go back and preach to the people who held me captive so that they can become free. So he went back to Ireland, and then
Mm.
the legends say that like he drove all the snakes out of Ireland and this and that. But what we do know for certain is that the way he preached, the way that he told his story and the story of Christ was so influential that nearly all of Ireland converted to Catholicism because of him, and then Saint Bridget and the disciples of him. But it was he who started that flame. And the very famous
Yeah.
thing that he did is he used the shamrock as a common, which was a common Irish symbol, to explain the Trinity, three persons in one God. So again, like using the cultural symbols that are already there to explain the faith in a way that's understandable to your audience. Just an amazing person. I could go on about him for a long time, but it would get off topic very quickly.
Yeah. No, that's the Irish connection. That is my love for Patrick
Mm,
as well. I also studied abroad in Dublin, and that's where I went to writing school and was just very tied up in my experience of being in the country with him and just aware of kind of the very long shadow that he has cast there specifically
yeah.
that has been so beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. We will be back next week with another regular episode talking through our ongoing walk through Advent and what it is that you can do to really open your gifts, give them to God on Christmas Eve to be able to move forward in giving God the gifts that he has given you back to him so that you can really make a sincere gift of yourself moving forward. I invite you to listen then. And then in 2 weeks, we'll be back with another episode talking about more saints for a specific charism. We'd love to have you join us then as well. In the meantime, God bless. And I hope that you are really able to grow in clarity around your story and how it is that God is inviting you to share that with others in your life.
Thanks so much for joining us on today's episode of Charisms for Catholics. If you would like to learn more about your charisms or begin your own discernment journey, head to our website at manypartsministries.com, where you can download our free PDF guide to all 24 charisms and also begin your own journey by taking our charism assessment.